And welcome back to Liberty on the Rocks. I'm your host, William Gadsden. I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Thomas Kilroy, and our guest, Chris, who is an expert on Murray Rothbard and several of the other main anarcho-capitalist philosophers and theorists of the 20th century. So first things first, let's talk about the scotch of the episode. I'm partaking in the Balvenie aged 14 years Caribbean cask, which is just outstanding. I haven't had it before, but I might have a new favorite. Tom, what have you got going on?
Sounds tasty.
I am keeping it simple, but also not classy. I had a couple or one. Bell's Two-Hearted Ale. That's a nice beer. And the old vintage 2017
Well, say hello
Fireball.
to your uncle cousin when you see them next time. Chris, what have you got going on?
Oh, stop.
Well, it's not as classy as the previous one. That Fireball is definitely a pure vintage of great quality and, prized among many smoking lounges across the world.
Yeah, all the best people say so.
Yeah. I'm just sipping on something simple, though. It's just the Lafroig 10-year, and it's the Islay single malt Scotch whiskey. I've had the 15-year, and it's a lot, or I think it's actually 18, but it's actually a lot better than this. But
I think I've had that one before. Is that more peaty than most single malts?
Awesome.
It's very, very peaty, actually. Yeah, it's really peaty. Some people don't like it. It says on the actual bottle sleeve, it's like kissing a mermaid that had barbecue for dinner, and that's pretty. That's pretty accurate.
My uncle, who is not also my cousin, unlike Tom's uncle / cousin.
Okay.
He told me when he was introducing me to scotches is that when it comes to peaty scotch, you either love it or you hate it, and I think that's been my experience as well. I'm not a big fan of peaty scotches, but if you like it, I applaud your gumption, sir.
Oh, thank you. One that I actually really like that's not ridiculously peaty, but just has like this weird kind of like boaty sea taste to it is Lagavulin. I really like Lagavulin, but it's a little bit expensive. Okay. So, yep.
All right. Well, let's dig into the meat and potatoes of this episode. As I mentioned before, the main topic is going to be Murray Rothbard. So, Chris, if you wouldn't mind, let's walk us through the 5 W's and an H as far as what we'll be discussing.
All right. Well, I might not go in order of that, but I'm just kind of talk about who Murray Rothbard was. So, Murray Rothbard is considered one of the original American libertarians, one of the original philosophers that led to the beginning of the Libertarian Party, and he's considered by some, he's been called by some Mr. Libertarian.
Oh, wow.
And so that's actually, he was one of the people who was the basis for a lot of the libertarian philosophies that we see now. In fact, Lew Rockwell in the introduction to For a New Liberty by Murray Rothbard says that when we're talking about libertarian principles and discussing them, a lot of people don't even realize that they're talking about concepts that he came up with because he was so influential in the philosophy itself. So he originally came from a background of being a historian and also in general philosophy itself, and he was an intellectual in that realm. And he uses a lot of arguments based on previous history and what things have been tried, in other places in the world. But then also a lot of his arguments are based off of ethics and what is considered harkening back to the classical liberal philosophies of the 18th and 19th centuries of what has been pretty much determined by like Locke and Hobbes and others as being a moral principle, and how can we expand upon that into the realm of politics, government, things like that, or not government, and then also how is this practically feasible? So that's pretty much about his philosophy there. and I think I covered who, what, when, where. Well, okay, why? Let's just say why. Murray Rothbard saw that that with any state, with any government, there's always an element of coercion. There's always an element of immorality, and he saw a need for people to realize that if they hold moral principles, they need to apply this without, broadly, without any scrutiny over, oh, well, they're doing it because of this. No, immorality is immorality. It is because a government says that they do it for good reason doesn't make it right. And so there was a huge disconnect that he saw in a lot of the Western world of people brushing off things that the government did and said, well, this is what's pragmatic, or this is what's practical. We know it's immoral, but it's practical. And it was encouraging. His writing is so encouraging, and it's very easy to read, and it actually encourages you rather than telling you that don't shortchange yourself. Be who you are and stand by these principles in every aspect. So I think that kind of answers your questions, doesn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. So let me ask you this: did he? I understand he comes from the Austrian School of Economics. Did he study directly under von Mises, or did they have any direct relation between the two?
Yes, I forgot to mention that. He had correspondence professionally with Ludwig von Mises, and I believe he did train underneath him. That's correct. Okay. I'm more concerned with his philosophy, so I've just kind of had to brush up really recently on the history of the guy. But yes, he had correspondence with F.A. Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, and several others that were around in that time. So there was really like a guild of people that got together and said, you know what, I think there needs to be a party founded around this, and that's kind of how that came about. But yeah.
Right, which has always kind of fascinated me because, I mean, if you look at the, I guess the obviously much more previous schools of thought as far as political philosophy is concerned, you mentioned John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, Rousseau, they didn't really collaborate as much as they kind of riffed off of one another, like John Locke kind of based some of his initial thoughts off of Thomas Hobbes, but then said, no, he's wrong, and let me explain why. And Rousseau did some similar things in regards to the other two, et cetera, et cetera. But it seems like with the Austrian School of Economics, they were all working together, as you said, to form an actual political party after developing all of their philosophical and economic models, which I think is just really interesting.
And it's actually really good that it occurred at the time that it did, because I think if the Austrian school would have come about, 50 to 100 years earlier, then it wouldn't have had the basis or the level of correspondence that it could have had in the 1970s, because, correspondence was a lot easier in the modern times than it was in, around the time of World War I. And also there's a lot more, the modern times, the early, 20th century was such a time where everything was tried out in government and sociology and everything else, and so there was a lot to build off of and come to conclusions from that. So
yeah, well, there's definitely,
it was almost like it came in at the right time.
It was almost providential in that sense, I think. It's interesting that you mentioned kind of that particular period of time, because it seems like in that era there was a lot of experimenting, as far as social models, economic models, different political models in government. You had the rise of the Soviet Union towards the end of World War I. Socialism was kind of in chic. It was the popular thing in the Western world. There was just a lot of moving pieces. And so, as you mentioned, it almost seems, providential is my word for it, but all of those things came together at just the right time, as you said. And I think that's just fascinating. One thing I wanted to touch on that you mentioned already was that Rothbard was very interested in the historical background or the historical support for his ideas. What can you tell us about that?
Well, he does give reference in give reference to slightly statist societies, or societies that existed a while ago. One of them is medieval Ireland, which the thing is, medieval Ireland did have a government, but at the same time, it was a government that took this laissez-faire, very, almost classical liberal approach. But the thing is, it was the natural way that they saw that it would happen. They raised armies when they were invaded by England, and people did it on pretty much a voluntary basis, based on family units. And the idea, and then also Iceland. In this time in the 1970s, Iceland basically had just a very small provisionary government that saw that basically restricted people from building, or said, hey, you probably don't want to build in that lava flow over there. Just saying, and then they said, okay. They were kind of just concerned with the environment. They had just a very, very small provisionary government, but it still wasn't voluntary in nature, but it was so small that it was just unrestrictive. One thing that he draws the most in For a New Liberty, for example, he draws the most examples from is the beginnings of the origins of the American political parties, and what stances they took economically and socially that have basically driven the motivation to have a party based on moral principles. And I know I keep coming back to that, but the thing is, it is such a part of when this book was written, For a New Liberty. And so I won't take up that time just babbling on.
Oh, no, please do. I mean, the concept of the podcast is, we want to dig into what these guys were thinking, what kind of their motivation was, right. What was the focal point of their philosophy. So, I mean, if that's what it is, man. We are totally open to that. And I am so open to that, to borrow Pam. What's Pam's last name on Archer? Do y'all watch Archer?
Oh, yeah. Pam Beasley.
There you go.
It's not Beasley. No, Pam Beasley's from The Office.
Yeah. Oh, shoot. I'm totally spacing it. I remember the episode with her sister where she's just a total bitch.
And Poovy,
anyway,
apparently.
Yeah. Poovy, yeah. There's a researcher in the clutch.
Yeah.
So I am totally open to that, as I was saying. That's great, man. So one thing that I found was very interesting in his essay, Anatomy of the State, which admittedly is almost the only thing that I've read by Rothbard so far. He talked about, obviously in Anatomy of the State, he breaks down the whole essay into why does the state exist, how does it exist, what sort of roles does it play, and how does it maintain power, all of these different sorts of things. I found it very interesting when he's talking about how the city-states in Italy kind of managed themselves, particularly when it came to warfare. Are you familiar with that?
Italy or Greece?
I thought it was Italy, but I could be wrong.
Okay. All right. But it was pretty much similar concepts, yes. But continue.
Oh, no,
Sorry.
not at all. So basically the way he was talking about how it would be based on mercenary armies between the cities. So the main merchants of one major city or another would hire mercenary armies. They would meet on a field of battle. They would maneuver. And then when it was very clear that one side or another was going to win the battle, they would call it quits and say, oh, yeah, that guy won. And this would minimize casualties and maximize profit on the part of the armies. And, higher up the chain, the merchants could have bragging rights and they would sort of win the argument between them and their rivals. But the sub-level of that on the civilian side of things, he points out that in this scenario, the civilians between one city or another wouldn't feel any sort of particular animosity towards civilians from the rival city. They would just keep going back and forth. Trade would continue, and that would be about it. And I thought that was just really interesting how he views warfare. And, of course, comparing that to how we see it today with patriotism and being suspicious of the other side and all of these different things. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think you mentioned, patriotism and things like that. And, I like that people like where they're from. That's kind of what patriotism is. It's good to, sing about the, purple mountains, majesties, and the fruited plains, and because it's true, they're beautiful. But at the same time, patriotism falls heavily into something that Rothbard abhorred, which was nationalism, and this was something that was very prominent in the conservative tradition, which something that he that he feels that the libertarian movement was done in response to a state of nationalism and an invasion of privacy, all in the name of protecting the state. And what you mentioned, having animosity towards like people of another country. Well, we were in World War II. We were at war with Germany and Japan, and there was a lot of people that very much had animosity towards people that were German and towards people who were Japanese living in the United States. And I think this becomes very dangerous. And Rothbard would say so too, because it's not built on really your the individual's well-being at all. You don't hate that person because they stole something from you, or they insulted you, or anything like that. You hate them because you're told to, and because you feel that everything that you've invested into the state would go away if we don't hate these people and crush them. That's very dangerous, and people are led on with this from mostly an economic standpoint, where people feel like they're invested into this role of the state because they say, well, part of my money's taken away and I get certain things back, and if that goes away, then what am I supposed to do? And this infrastructure is built up of a process of theft and redistribution, and it's very ineffective at it. And Rothbard goes, and that's a method of controlling people's psyche. And that's taking all propaganda aside. People think that way because they think personally, economically. Does that kind of answer your question a little bit there? Or
absolutely. So I want to dive into that a little bit more. A couple of the things that you said. So basically, what you're saying is they use the idea or the concept of patriotism. Let's call it what it is: nationalism, and they use that to sort of obfuscate or to otherwise disguise the extortion that they're experiencing through taxation. Is that accurate to say?
Through taxation, yeah, through taxation, but then also it leads to other things as well. Like the Patriot Act is a perfect example of that, where people were pissed off and they were saddened, and 9/11 was terrible, and people wanted to do anything to stop it from happening again. And that was that situation. And if we look at the origins of the Patriot Act, it actually goes back to the Clinton administration, way before anything happened. Like the state was gearing up to have something like this implemented, but the technology wasn't there for one reason or another, and they found their opportunity to do it. And so people said, like, well, we pay the government to do this, then they should stop it, And so everything goes in Rothbard's idea. Everything goes back to really look at the money, follow the money. People are being extorted for the state to exist. It is a parasite, and that's one of the reasons why the state exists, and why it maintains itself. Why it exists is something called the iron law of oligarchy. Okay. And he also uses this as a method of how businesses are formed. Whereas if you have a group of people, there are some people that are the most energetic, the most ideological about the idea, and they're going to be the natural leaders. They're going to come up with ideas, and then other people are going to be natural followers and maybe just like say, well, you know what, I'll do this part-time, but whatever. But if you have those people already instilled, the people that are the leaders, and you're born into it, then you're like, well, I don't need to be a leader then. And you're naturally suppressed.
It's the path of least resistance, but at the same time, you're sacrificing far more than what you realize.
Right. And if you were born into a place where it's like, well, these people are kind of not too prominent. I mean, there's that guy that leads that business over there. There's that guy that leads that group over there. But where do I fit in? You know what? I have this idea. Yeah, and then it starts from there. And you kind of, so it's almost like anarcho-capitalism really isn't really, and this has been kind of been crapped upon, as it's not really anarchism, because it's really not, because the idea of anarchism is that it's a society without hierarchy. But the thing is about anarcho-capitalism or voluntarism is that these hierarchies fall naturally. You do not have anybody above you that you do not want to be above you. If you join a company, well, then obviously you say, hey, I don't mind you bossing me around because I get money out of it. So that's kind of getting down the rabbit hole from your original question, fine. But you know how it
that's
is.
Fine. That's what this podcast is designed for, my friend.
Right.
So basically, this falls back on the idea that the hierarchy, even a hierarchy within a company or a government, is all dictated on the market, and what value the market dictates. So let's say if your boss really sucks, you're going to require a bare minimum amount of money to work for this guy or gal, and if not, you're going to go on somewhere else. But that the entire idea is predicated on the idea that you can move freely, to another company or outside of the government to the private sector and all of these different things.
Right. The idea behind that's the idea is that really if there was a company that, let's just say that a company prohibited that once you sign up for life. Well, Murray Rothbard goes into where that is actually not possible in a philosophical standpoint for somebody to do that, because someone cannot give up their moral agency. They don't have the agency to give up their moral agency. Like, that's the highest thing that you have, within your reasoning. But that doesn't really help the situation, because it's going to happen. So since everything is basically solved by market, then if you found out, and of course we live in the age of the internet where it's like, hey, this company sucks, boycott them. And they do. A lot of people do, and they end up going under. And even in our modern days when we have government subsidies and things like that. So if you find out, hey, this guy's like actually keeping, people against their will, or he's keeping them from going to other jobs, stop buying stuff from him. Or, start your own business that does the exact same thing. And then, people will work for you. You'll make a product. You'll undercut his company, because to maintain people living there has got to cost him a lot of money. He's running a prison. So there's a whole bunch of different market ways that could be solved by that. And it would take the whole podcast if we went into just that specific example.
Very good, very good. So basically, as long as we can achieve true free market principles, then we can additionally achieve a more, let's see, I'm trying to think of the right way to word this, a more liberty-centered society.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. So in a lot of ways, this is similar to what I understand about Hayek's philosophy. Society and economics and liberty are all inseparably intertwined with one another, which the more I learn more about it, the more it makes sense to me. So that's some really good stuff right there. Let's see.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Tom, you've been pretty quiet.
Yeah, well, I kind of want to get into the weeds a little bit in terms of
get that cork open.
That bottle.
Yeah.
In terms of, I mean, Good gracious. We're talking about a moral code and morality and how people steer that and whether they can or can't give that up. There's some things that he teaches. I see what he's talking about in terms of this is the logical conclusion to what he's talking about. But, when we were off, we're not on camera, but before we started recording, we talked about, these particular issues, and I'm talking about his perspective on parenting. And you said, yeah, there are a couple things that you do not believe are his best philosophies, or they aren't the best way for people to live, something to that effect. What do you mean by that, and how do you dive into that?
I think we kind of have to, for our listeners here, I think we kind of have to go into where does he conclude that morality stems from, or what is the moral principle? And it's something that he describes as the non-aggression principle. And this was something originally thought of by John Locke in 1689. And before him, it was actually, in a lot of religious texts, the Bible, the Bible, the Torah. There's also some Eastern texts that was in Taoism. Basically, this is their base moral principle. But he describes it as, and I quote, "No man may threaten or commit violence against another man's person or property. Violence may be employed only against the man who commits such violence. That is, only defensively against the aggressive violence of another." That was his that's the basis of what he derives as being moral. It's basically the golden rule: do unto others as you would have do unto you. That's it. And so when we talk about parenting, and he talks about parenting, and he basically says, he basically concludes that, since property is something that you can see where I'm going with this, since property is something that you are entrusted with the care of, and it is something that you only benefit from, and that you maintain all of its idiosyncrasies and its control, that children are property. And this is where it starts to get really hairy. Okay. So Rothbard holds that parents have the right to abandon their children at any time, regardless of consequences. He also insists that abortion is a right. The difference between Rothbard and other pro-choicers is that he's quite willing to concede that the preborn are persons. And he makes it quite clear that his arguments apply equally well to the preborn infants and all children. And basically, and this is something that I like, of all of his teachings, this is the conclusion that I disagree with. And so he derives this from, it kind of goes against, in my opinion, the conclusion that he comes to elsewhere, that we are all self-owners, that our body is our property. And so therefore, if somebody, and property, or we own our bodies, and that property is an extension of that. Well, how does a child's body how is that part of yours? Like a child that's born, let's not even get into abortion, but a child that's born, how is that, besides DNA, how are they part of you? One argument to that is that they don't have moral agency. They don't know right from wrong. They haven't been taught it, or they just do things without knowing that if it's right or wrong or not. But I don't know if you can prove it. I don't know if you can prove that. And we would have to delve into the weeds of, clinical psychology. Maybe Jordan Peterson would have something to say about it. But I don't think, I think that children are innately born with knowing that taking other people's stuff is wrong. Hitting people is wrong. Maybe even being racist is wrong. We don't know. And that's kind of something that's instilled into them. But I honestly disagree because I feel like it's quite crass. Now, that being said, what's the solution to this? Well, some that have proposed, instead of Rothbard's conclusion, to come to one where if you have a child, then it is like your responsibility now that you still violate the NAP if you abandon them or you abuse them or do something like that. That it is your prerogative to do that. They aren't an extension of your body. They're a whole other body all in of themselves. They have their own property. So yeah.
Right. Well, and the NAP being the non-aggression principle, just for anyone who forgot that. But to carry that forward, well, I'm not going to be an aggressor. This is his philosophy. I guess I'm thinking it out. Well, I'm not an aggressor if I let my child starve to death. I'm not actively hurting them. But I don't. Yeah. So obviously, I'm struggling with this because from what I read, his thoughts on it were that it should essentially be a free trade market on children, where if you want to give them up for adoption, you should sell them. If you want to let them starve, you should let them starve. If you want to buy a child, then that is your right, because you already said that he treats them like property. But it seems like it's only because he thinks that they don't have cognitive thought, they don't own property, and they can't vote, therefore they don't matter. That kind of philosophy several hundred years ago was employed to another people group, and I don't know. He never talked about slavery. I don't think
for a little bit inside For New Liberty, and I don't know if I can reference that right now. But he touches on the fact, off of the base fact that nobody has like the moral agency to like sign someone else's rights away or sign their moral agency away, much less even theirs. So.
Well, I think that's the next natural question here is like, does he ever specify what the difference is? What's the breaking point between a child and not having inherent personal rights and being an adult and apparently having inherent personal rights?
To my knowledge, and I could be wrong on this because to tell you the truth, I haven't really looked into this side of it as much as I have other places. But,
because it's
what's
kind
that?
of ridiculous, I'm
what's
sure. That? Because it's kind of ridiculous, the premise of letting a kid starve.
That's assuming why. It's because
looked into
his base, or not his base, but like his conclusion premise of this whole thing is ridiculous. But because the thing is, it's and I think there's other conclusions that can come from, his whole idea of the NAP and then like personal property and stuff, because he draws the ideas of personal property to its extreme. I'm going to say that he would have to draw you'd have to draw the line between a child and an adult, that they own property and produce something with it.
So they have to be a contributing member to society. They have to do something rather than just be a property owner. Is that what you mean?
I would have to say it's either one of the two. Maybe he draws the line out at property. No,
that's okay.
I feel bad for not knowing this, but yeah.
Well, no, that's fine. And I would say to everyone that's listening, what is truth is truth. Just because we all are saying that he has a ridiculous idea about letting a kid starve doesn't take away from any of the things and that he said about economic principles that are true. I think it's important to address that because some years ago, I would catch myself saying, "Oh, well, they said that. Well, that's ridiculous. Let's just throw everything out. Just to I guess to try to be funny. Throw the baby out with the bathwater." But let's just get rid of all of it because I can't stand this one thing that the person's saying. I don't think that makes sense. I think we need to listen to what people have to say and actually try to discern what has worth and kind of build on those things.
Now, here's another element to this. To this thing that could be, to this idea with children that could be a solution to, and the thing is, it's projected in a way like, sell your kid. Okay, let's just say like your neighbor is starving your kid, all right, and you know it, and you want to save the kid. Well, do you think you could bribe their parents to take their kid away from them with money?
That's what you'd have to do.
I mean,
right? You'd have to say, "Well, I'll buy."
Sorry,
them
go ahead.
Because that's your property.
So, yeah, it's still kind of like in that. But let's just try to like entertain the idea, like, well, okay, maybe this is the way it's going to happen or something.
Okay.
And so, if that were to occur, then yes, or maybe you have adoption agencies that make money off of saving kids, and you pay a fee to adopt a kid, which that's kind of what happens now, but with a little bit more regulation by the state. But it's also something that costs people a lot more money, and we have a lot of orphans that end up going starving, or end up going to foster homes that are crappy. And so that's a caveat to that on the current system, but it's hard to know what it would look like. Generally speaking, though, people starve their kids now, and I know that's a terrible example, but
right.
it does happen now, even with all the state control and surveillance and everything else. So yeah.
Well, I think it not only is it carrying forward the ideas that we said before about property, but it's that the laissez-faire ideology and the true libertarian thought of the government shouldn't intrude in anything that he has. This would be a perfect example. If I wanted to not feed my child and wanted to sell them or not sell them, the government can't tell me whether I can do that or not. I just kind of want to emphasize that it seems like it's just these are the logical conclusions of my arguments. This is the end goal. This is where we can arrive outside of common thought on morality.
True. And honestly, like, he's him saying like, you can starve your kid if you want to. It seems like it doesn't. I don't know. It seems like it doesn't go into the whole scope of like what can happen. Like, okay, well, maybe you don't have very much money and your kid is starving, and then you're just like, well, I can't take care of my kid. I have to find something to do, and he would be better with another family. And, and most of the time, unless somebody is psychotic or completely addicted to drugs or something like that, I feel like in most cases that would be the situation. Or your neighbor says, hey, can I take care of your kid for you? Things like that. I feel like most people have it ingrained, like, you probably shouldn't let kids starve. It's like,
well, yeah, I would certainly
like, and they'll probably do something to prevent it. Some places where religious places, churches and synagogues and mosques can step up and take care of that, and that's something that he also addresses as well, is that if a church wants to run a daycare, or if a church wants to hand out food to homeless people, well, in some places that's banned. You just can't feed homeless people in the street. But that's something that the church says that it's their role. It's one of the tenets of Islam. It's one of the tenets of Christianity. And so is the state getting into into the church more than the church was, just as the church was getting into the state back in the Middle Ages. So, and he makes that reference in the For a New Liberty as well. But yeah.
I want to interject here real quick because I don't want to get too bogged down in this god awful kind of tangent as far as his view on children, at least as far as we can see. So I want.
Well, it was just a strong.
It's one of the more prominent things that people say about anarcho-capitalism as a whole is that it doesn't care about children and elderly people.
Yeah.
So
right, and that's exactly what I want to counter with this interjection. It's an extremely important topic to tackle because it is uncomfortable, and just purely because it's uncomfortable, that means that it is something that we need to address. That being said. In all of my playthroughs of Fallout New Vegas, I've never sold the kid that you rescue from the refrigerator into slavery. I'm really glad Chris got that reference.
All I'm going to say about New Vegas is if you do not end that game where you're not the dictator, Mr. House is not the dictator, you have a free and independent New Vegas, you are a statist. That's all I gotta say.
I'm gonna be honest with you. In my current playthrough, I sided with the NCR, and I regret nothing.
No.
Anyway, but so I want to emphasize a couple of things really quick, as far as the topic of children in an anarcho-capitalist society is concerned. It is. I want to stress that it is the logical conclusion that you would come to if you were following his philosophy strictly. And I think it's very interesting, Chris, when you mentioned the idea that if you are to be a part of this society, not that it is required for membership, if you will, but you are mixing your labor with the property, and that is an extremely Lockean principle. I mean that was the whole foundation of John Locke's philosophy, is that you mix your labor with the soil, and the product of that mixture is your property. So Rothbard is following the logical, his philosophy to its logical conclusion. Excuse me, Tom. I also want to give a lot of emphasis to the point you made about throwing out the baby with the bathwater. I think that was you that made that point. I'm a few drinks in at this point. Thank you. And
it wasn't me. That's for sure.
And I love that you made that point because
he loves
I love babies, but not in the illegal sense.
Yeah.
So, have you ever seen a Serbian film?
Yes.
Don't, Tom. Don't.
Please
don't
do not.
Do it.
No, everybody listening to this, do not mention.
Just don't do it. Don't do it.
Don't. All right.
Anyway. I think it's safe to say that in the majority of conversations I've had with people that aren't strict libertarians or, minarchists or ANCAP or whatever sort of sub-level you want to divide it into, I think the main point that they bring up is that, well, if the government didn't provide this thing, then, who would? Which brings me to the other point that I wanted to bring up. When you bring up religious charity specifically, whether it be Islam, Judaism, Christianity, Taoism, all of these groups are willing to provide these services in and of themselves on a purely voluntary basis. So not only does this make sense pragmatically, but it also makes the most sense morally. And of course, in the modern context, we also have to look at organizations that are non-religious. There are literally, quote unquote, churches, if you will, that are based on atheistic principles, and that's fine because they're still catering to those in need based on humanist ideology or whatever the case may be. Tom, this is something we talked about with our close friend Winston. The free market, and this is where we bring it full circle back to Rothbard. The free market will provide wherever a need is wherever it is present, whether that be through a transaction like a business or whether that be through charity. But the main point being that this is a vastly morally superior system when compared to coercion and force, which I think is one of the main points that Rothbard was getting at. unless I'm off base here.
Oh no, absolutely. That's one of the greatest strong points of this philosophy, and it's more. And I've had conversations with family members and things like that. Close friends and family members is that well, okay, we've all heard the argument. Well, who would build the roads? Who would do this or that? Who would look out for the poor people? Well, when you come across that, just ask them, do you think that's important? Do you think it's important that, poor people get something to eat and that, roads are built, things like that? And they'll, of course, say yes. And that's why they're arguing against you, because they think it's important. And then you ask them, would you give your money to do that? Just to that? Well, would you give your money to make sure a poor person's fed? Or would you pay for the roads that you drive on? And they say, well, yeah. And it's like, well, other people are paying for it who don't want to. Some people might have, okay, who will build the roads? Let's take roads, for example. There might be somebody who rides a bike, and they hardly, that doesn't cause any wear and tear on the road at all. They could ride a bike on the grass if they wanted to. But do you think they should pay just as much as someone who has six work trucks and a skid steer and 5 motorcycles and all this other kind of stuff? They pay just as much. Do you think that's fair? No, it's not. So that person who rides a bicycle, who's trying to be good to the environment or whatever motivation that he has, get exercise, he has to pay. He's being coerced into providing for someone else's excess.
Sorry, go ahead.
And you should be able. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so I wanted to emphasize that. So whatever their altruistic motivations may be, they're concerned about the environment, or they, whatever the case may be, as far as transportation or really any other example, they obviously have motives that are apart from financial. But if you also increase their financial incentive, people are more prone to give in to their altruistic motivation. On the flip side of that, however, and I think this is the point you were making, is that if government removes that financial incentive, then less and less people are going to be prone to do the other things that are also good for society as a whole.
I'm sorry. Could you repeat?
Right.
Was that a question?
I was more just commenting your point overall.
I think the Scotch.
It's
the Scotch is trying
I was
to
like,
get to
wait.
you.
Speaking of Scottish accent, I can understand you. No, but anyway.
Well, I want to circle back around because it's so funny to me how many folks who have a statist mentality or are loving the fact that they get to not think about it and just throw money at the government. I want to bring up the point. It seems like it's less than 3% of our GDP, of our gross domestic product, goes to infrastructure.
And also it's so good to consider that gas tax. Okay, so there's tax on gasoline, and that mostly goes to pay for roads. So it's still tax, but at the same
well, does it?
Yeah,
though?
That's the other part about it, is that's what it's supposed to be allocated for, I should say. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think, William, you said you were looking at a breakout of some kind of tax form, and it said whatever you had to pay, and then you looked and you were like double or triple taxed for the road, and none of it went to it or something. Do you remember that conversation we had?
Yeah, I absolutely remember that conversation. We were actually discussing the registration renewal that my wife had got in the mail, and she drives a kind of a early 2010 or 2010s model vehicle. It's not an SUV or anything like that. It's a sedan. And her vehicle registration, we live in the Southeast, for relatively full disclosure here. We live in the Southeast where generally these sorts of things, government regulation in the market isn't very high and this sort of thing. Her vehicle registration renewal fee was $240. So in the state that we live in, the idea is that, well, our vehicle registration goes to pay for the roads. Okay, fine. That's fair. Whatever. It's the state we live in. Let's roll with it. But as I'm looking at this this renewal slip, asking her to send in a check or go to the treasurer's office and pay the fee, whatever the case may be, for $240, they went to the extra effort to put in a breakdown of what all of that money is going to be going towards. So while ostensibly it's my roads, it ended up being the local school system, the college system across the entire state, infrastructure such as bridges and that sort of thing, apart from roads. I mean, we're talking about like
drawbridges.
What is it when you've got the bridges that lift up for the ships to go through and all this sort of thing? Thank you. Exactly. Drawbridges. There were probably close to a dozen different itemized things that this money was going towards, apart from the roads themselves. And just as an aside, the roads in our state are absolute garbage. So obviously, if the small amount of money that was itemized in that slip is actually going towards the roads, it's obviously not doing a very good job, or at least it's not being managed properly. And this is in addition to a recent statewide tax hike on gas specifically, again, per politicians' promises, that money is supposed to go towards the roads, again, are still total garbage. So I think, I was just going to say this again comes back around to Rothbard's overall idea that the private individual or the private organization built upon the foundation of the individual can provide a far better product when compared to the public sector, and in addition to that, be morally superior because it's based on voluntarism.
So just something that, like the example that I made earlier with like the bike rider, it's like you can say, well, yeah, you have to pay vehicle registration and bike riders don't. Well, okay, in some cities they do. You have to register your bicycle. But that aside, so a lot of people, use this as an example for like, well, why we shouldn't pay income tax. Well, technically income tax is not supposed to be used to, pay for that kind of stuff. That's kind of what I was getting at with that. But going back, staying on the subject of roads, if you think about like, okay, well, who will build the roads? Who builds the roads now?
Yeah, exactly.
Private companies. Private companies are contracted by the city, the state, everybody else. The city, the state, whoever it may be, to work for them to build a certain road. But the thing is, here's the difference. It is bogged down by bureaucracy. You have people who have never built a road in their life telling people who are experts in building roads how it has to be done. And it might not make sense. They might say, well, we shouldn't do it this way. Why aren't we just building this as fast as we can? We'll work 24 hours to get this done. Nope. You have to abide by certain labor laws and you have to abide by this or that. Why not build it nonstop 24 hours a day? It would get done faster. And here's the thing. If there were private companies, think of like your apartment complex. You have the people who own the buildings, but then you also have like a housing management. Well, you could have a tiered business like that where, one company is in charge of maintenance, the other company is in charge with, subscriptions, and you could have like a Netflix roads where you have a sticker on your car and that's your paid subscription for the roads in this particular town or this, particular area. And if you don't travel out of that area, it's great. And then maybe you can pay, if you only travel on the highway every now and then, you pay like a one-time fee, or you could pay by the mile, or you could pay a subscription, or pay nothing. And you could just live in your little town and you don't have to pay for something you don't use. And all the money that you use would directly go to that company to maintain it. And then of course, if they say, hey, do we want to build this nice little, intersection in the middle of town here? Would you increase your subscription fees to pay for that? And then some people are going to be like, yeah, that'd be fun. And then they're going to increase their fees so that can get built. Little ideas like that. The private companies are very ingenious in coming up with that. So,
well, I'm so glad that you drew that parallel between Netflix. I know I giggled a little bit. I'm pretty deep in the bottle at this point. But you said Netflix roads. Okay, so it's kind of funny, but at the same time, no, that's totally accurate. And when you mentioned that, you're only paying for the roads that you consistently travel on, so you have a sticker or what have you. That just, nail on the head. My wife, to bring her up again, is originally from Louisiana, and from what I understand, I've not personally experienced this. But in Louisiana and several other states, it's common to have a sticker on the front window of your vehicle to signify that you are from that state and you have paid registration fees for that state. And so basically it's just a quick reference for law enforcement or what have you, to kind of look and verify that, you are from this state and you're good to go, your registration's up to date, whatever. And I just think it's so funny that you're already pointing out good ideas that the private sector would implement when the public sector is copying those ideas because they've seen how much more efficient it is. So we can use that as a base point and consider how much more efficient it could be from there. If the private sector is already coming up with good ideas, how much more efficient could it be? And so, it seems like to bring it back around to Rothbard, it seems like the way things are going right now, he would probably just be spinning in his grave considering how much better things could be. And I know from personal experience, that's something that has frustrated the absolute shit out of me, I've worked for the government for almost a decade at this point. And every day I'm at work, I just shake my head and go, there's such a simpler way to do this. And I understand that's anecdotal evidence. But at the same time, I think it very much holds true. And this was one of the main things that Rothbard was trying to get at, as far as his overall philosophy.
I think it's an interesting idea, and we can talk about, you can research it, about the itemized prices for hammers that the government pays. To me, the price that they pay for a hammer for the military is obscene. And just, am I wrong? I've looked it up, and I'm just like,
no, you're not wrong.
Are obscene. From the outside looking in, this is an absolute racket.
That everybody likes to use. Everybody likes to use that example of like the hammer, but it's even deeper than that. Like ask it like anybody who's been a contractor overseas or has been in the military. I hear a lot from my friends that they go over there and they just see stuff that's like just wasted, like it's just thrown in burn pits and just thrown away, but they can't get water.
Right.
It's stuff like that, and it almost harkens to the time of like where the Soviet Union was still around, where they had more rifles than they did people.
Yeah,
or they had more, like stuff like that,
and they ammunition, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's like they had it was just overproduction in one area, whatever, and it's the it's Hayek's thing. It's like that. It's central planning, and Rothbard has a lot of stuff like that. That you have some guy at the top thinking up big things and be like, "Hey, this would be a good idea," and no one has the goal to question him,
right?
And no one has the goal to question him, but then then the little guy on the ground, actually shoveling the asphalt, or fighting the enemy is saying, why? I'm seeing everything that's happening. Why is it done this way?
Yeah. We can basically name topic du jour, whether it's healthcare or infrastructure, military spending, law enforcement. It's like it doesn't seem that legislators are actually consulting folks that are doing the day-to-day work. And if they do, occasionally I'll watch C-SPAN, but you'll see the people talk and they're like, oh yeah, oh wow, that's great. And then they just continue to legislate like they have no idea that this person just testified and gave fantastic firsthand account on how things should be organized. It just boggles my mind, but yet we'll throw money at them. Oh, here's an issue. Let's just keep throwing money at it. Maybe it'll get fixed. I don't understand.
So one of the things about we talked about Netflix roads, but one of the things that Rothbard goes through quite a bit is the idea of policing, like how would policing be done differently, and what would be a libertarian outlook on policing, and the idea that you have people going around looking for money to, and I'm not saying cops are bad. Cops are very good people. I know quite a few of them. I totally did a Trumpism there, but cops are good people.
Well, to be fair, some
of my best friends
police officers aren't great, and I know them too. Actually,
that's true. That's true. But it's every profession. But like I was getting back to, is that should we have people roaming around, putting themselves at risk and putting other people at risk, just kind of looking for ways to make money for the state? Or how about you have Netflix police, where you pay a subscription, and if you have something go wrong at your house and you're like, bro, I need backup. and they
no, it's really not that outlandish though.
Then they come to your house
South Africa right now, right, William? Did you see all that?
That's like,
oh well, yeah. I've been following Lauren Southern's documentary very closely, because Lauren Southern is just.
Oh right,
yeah, she's easy on the eye.
She's a lot of things. Anyway,
the whole premise is. If you look at the numbers of percentage of police officers in a ratio to private police, it's staggering.
Right.
There's a large amount of basically mercenaries, just to bring it back full circle to what you're talking about, Italy, which that whole conversation kind of reminded me of Assassin's Creed 2. Yeah. Just the mercenaries. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's all that kind
actually,
of thing. But, paying to be protected is kind of an interesting idea. I could see that working. I could see it totally backfiring, like mercenaries in Colombia and in Mexico, where, okay, I got paid by this other guy a little bit more money. I'm actually a double agent, and I'm not going to help you when you need it most. So, I mean, there are definitely pitfalls.
Sure, but then you're not going to have any repeat customers.
Well, yeah, they'll be dead.
See that I was just gonna say that. So if you have a company that's vested in its customers to provide a good product, to provide a good service, then if that starts happening, then maybe people just stop paying, or maybe people go to a different company. And you may not know this, but warfare is kind of expensive. Just saying.
Oh, I know. I saw
yeah, right. Warfare is kind of expensive, and it's something that private companies really don't get into unless there is a significant return.
Right.
In which I can't imagine. Private companies struggle as it is, and they would be able to provide a better product under a capitalist system, because they would probably have better body armor, maybe better weapons, things like that, and it quite possibly, like, they would be a lot more friendly to their customers, because they want you to have a good time while you're. It's like walking into a store. They want you to have a good time while you're
being robbed.
Are we still talking
We're
about?
We're still talking about police. Still talking about police. They want you to.
Okay.
Want you to just
I was like,
driver still. You know what I'm saying? It's just. They want you to have a good time.
I'm making fun, but you make sense.
With like, oh yeah, we're talking about war. And then all of a sudden, yeah, they just want you to have a good time.
No, they want you to be comfortable. They want to provide a higher quality of customer service. Okay, so if I may, I'm trying not to say too much. I don't want to disclose a whole lot. So my wife is in a career that involves a lot of coordination with law enforcement, and she's had a lot of experiences where, as she is trying to get help from the local law enforcement department or what have you, they're not very friendly, they're not very cooperative, And this is literally one professional to another trying to coordinate, getting their jobs done. And, they're throwing up obstacles in her way and being obstinate and all of these different things. And it's like, look, this isn't even a consumer to a salesman, or this isn't even a customer to a company or a business. This is between two professionals. Yes.
Yeah, it's business
and
to
so
business.
Even then,
Right.
So imagine if you had an organization, a private law enforcement organization that was providing the same service, but they had incentive to provide a higher quality of service. And not only from business to business, but between business and the consumer themselves, which is obviously the main crux of this argument.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It would be kind of the difference between, honestly, if you went and stood in like a welfare line compared to a soup line at a church or something like that. Obviously, one is a lot more friendly, and they have a vested interest, be it altruistic, to have that. So it's kind of the difference, or in the idea between people who have a vested interest in actually providing a service for you, or people who do it because they're being paid by somebody else, and whatever, regardless of however they treat people, or do a certain thing, they can get away with doing certain things and they still get a paycheck. So, it's not going to be like, hey, Bob, that customer really hated the way that you talked to them. We lost them. Right. You're fired. If that, current policing, that isn't a thing. They're still going to pay their tax. So
they're still going to get paid.
Whatever.
I want to draw one thing back around full circle to Rothbard. So before you mentioned, or we had talked a little bit about how in order for the free market to work, there had to be a distinct lack of regulation in the market on the part of the government. And in the same way, when you talked about private law enforcement, you said, you didn't say, hey, I need someone to come save me. You said, hey, I need backup. With the implication being that the backup is in addition to what self-defense you already have. And I think that's a very important point to make. In this scenario with private law enforcement, it's not that, hey, I need to wait 15 minutes for the cops to show up and save me. It's that, well, I've already got a 12 gauge, or I've got an AR, and I've got these guys pinned down. I need somebody else.
An MG42
in Kapistan, I would love to have an MG42. But the cartridges, what are those, 7.92? Those are a little bit weird. I don't know if I could keep
8mm Mauser, 7.92.
Oh, sure, but
you can buy
the
them.
market will provide. But I don't know how many people are going to buy MG42s, although they are just some of the most blessed weapons reproduced created by man.
Well, do you think companies would reproduce them?
I mean, if I've got a tripod set up on my front door, I think the market will provide. But
I don't think that's how that works.
What? Well, okay, let's get into it. Why do you not think that's how that works?
Just because you have a tripod on your front porch, someone's going to make you a weapon for it?
Oh, no.
Because the implication was that if I've got a tripod, I've got an MG42. And if I've got an MG42, I have to keep it fed with the proper rounds for it. And if I need to keep it fed with the proper rounds for it, and enough other people have to do the same, then a company will produce the rounds for it.
So you're saying you're creating a market, and someone will rise to meet market demand with a product?
Yes, exactly.
Yes, I agree with that, so long as said company learns that the market need is there. They're not just going to spontaneously acquire this knowledge.
So now we have MG42s, all of us. And I'm totally okay with that. Actually, Chris, in one of our mutual Facebook groups, I was talking back and forth with a guy.
Like mutualism? Okay, podcast is over.
Oh, gosh. Are we getting into that? Come on now.
Wow.
No,
Did
of course.
You say this one part of a very complicated issue? Is that
it's voluntary mutualism? It's okay.
That's actually good that's actually good that was brought up, though, because it's like I feel like that's something that like maybe would occur in Kapistan, if you want to use that term. It may be something that would occur. You might have like voluntary socialism, where, and at the same time, if Murray Rothbard says, you know, like the iron law of oligarchy, like there's going to be people who are in charge and stuff like that. Well, okay, maybe you have like a very small, you know, like let's say us three, we are kind of poor, but together we can buy a t-shirt machine, and then, you know, a t-shirt machine, and then like a place to have it. And then we just kind of start making money. And then, you know, eventually we're able to kind of afford an apartment off of like the designs we're making, stuff like that. We're kind of living in socialism. Like we're all three roommates or whatever. And, but it's,
I mean,
kind of, but we're surviving off of capitalistic means. So it's not really socialism, but whatever.
Right.
But,
so this, I'm sorry. Can finish your thought. I didn't mean to cut in.
Well, it's only so much as socialism as we would all three be poor, even though we'd be working really hard.
Wow.
Hey, what if people really like our t-shirts? Don't tell Vinny you said that, or he's going to disown you.
He's probably going to listen to this.
Right? No, he absolutely will.
No, what I'm saying is the minute that we would have enough money to sustain ourselves, we wouldn't be pooling our resources together.
Right.
We would be able to do whatever we want.
I mean, maybe.
Right?
Yeah, sure.
And I was also taking a jab at just the idea that, you know, socialism and poverty are kind of synonymous.
Well, see, here's the thing,
understand
though.
what you were doing, but yeah.
Because you're right, but to get into the nuance of this, just because we're all kind of drunk, and I think this is hilarious, you know, if you're talking about definitive socialism, then that means that the government owns at least some of the means of production for any given market, you know, or at
Correct.
least not.
Oh, that's a great
Correct,
point.
and Rothbard actually has commentary on that. So, yeah, here, just a second. Continue with what your point is. I'm going to look something up.
Okay, so
yeah, I want to see you
so
weigh in on it.
Yeah, absolutely. I really want to hear about that. So, like, it not necessarily owns, but at least controls at minimum. So, in our scenario, hypothetical as it is, if there are enough people voluntarily taking part in the pooling of these resources, I wouldn't necessarily call that socialism. You know, we can make fun of them and you know, oh yeah, they're hippies and, you know, whatever, they've got a commune going on. But as long as I'm sorry, I lost the word for it. The head shed, the top dog isn't keeping head shed.
What the heck is a head shed?
You've never heard head? Okay, it's a military term. Anyway, like head shed is like, you know, the commander and the command staff. You know, the head shed.
No, that's the HMFIC.
Oh dear God, Chris, we're not going to get into this right now. We'll do it off air. Off
air.
We'll do it live. Anyway, so if the guy at the top of the food chain, as long as he is not restricting free movement between the individuals that are involved in this pooling of resources, I wouldn't really call that socialism. You know, I mean, they can still do what they want. They can separate from the agreement whenever they want to. You know, I don't see anything wrong with that as far as from a liberty-centered perspective.
So I can't find it right now, but essentially, like when it comes into like voluntarism, you know, you could have like it could be considered socialism, but more like liberal socialism or libertarian socialism or something like that.
Getting into lib
where
socks?
Sorry, okay, I have to use that word because it's voluntarism, though it like extends to like if you want to be like a little like mutualist society between like three people, then who's going to stop you? You're producing it. You know, you're producing a product. You're basically like, for all intensive purposes, like a family. Like, think about that. Like, if you're like, let's say you have like a family, you know, mom, dad, dad, mom, and a kid, or whatever, however you want to say. And one person produces uses the property to produce all of the products, and they make the money off of it. How is that any different than the three of us collectively working? Sorry, I had to use that word, bastard. Collectively. Sorry.
Oh man.
to do the same thing, or 3 times the thing, or something like that. How are we not a business?
Right.
See what I'm saying? And then,
so is it just the scale? Is that the difference? That it's a family?
Well, I mean, it might be
rather than a small society.
I mean, it's however you really want to envision it. The point being is that you're producing something from land. You're mixing your labor. All of the people in that society are mixing their labor to produce a product that people want. It could be 20 people. It could be 10. It could be 100. You just, let's say we all work at a factory, and everybody has voluntarily agreed that if you work at this factory, you live in this apartment building and you just get your rent for free. But the thing is, nobody has to enter into that if they don't want to. Now, I don't see something like that being feasible or happening, but it's just an illustration. I think it would work better at a smaller level, maybe 3 to 20 people, something like that. That they could probably enter into it and leave it if they wanted to.
Yeah, I don't know if you and I talked about this, William, but I think we did, maybe not. But it is the whole idea of collective society like that. Even in that movie, The Village.
But The Village was a spook, though.
Yeah. So now you're bringing in.
You're
damn it!
welcome
What's
for
that guy's name?
The Village. But
Sterner. Yeah, thank you.
Sterner.
Max Sterner.
Yeah, sorry. We won't stay on that because let's try to stay on topic here. Yeah, but anyway. Yeah.
Okay. But anyway, the Village or A Wrinkle in Time, not A Wrinkle in Time. What is it? I don't know. But basically, it's the same idea that there are families that gathered together and they locked themselves away and Running Out of Time, I think was the name of that book. But that society fell apart pretty much after one generation.
That's quite possible that it could happen, but should you stop somebody from doing that?
No, absolutely not, because then you're robbing them of their liberty.
I was just
exactly.
Yeah, I was just adding credence to your argument that you're not even sure if it would work. I was just providing a couple examples.
Simply to play the contrarian. Simply to play the contrarian here, because I think this is a really great conversation. Tom, we know of a particular group in our hometown that is a commune. You know where I'm going with this. And hey, they make some really good sandwiches. You literally cannot refute this. Oh my gosh. Anyway, so they are a commune. They do. I think it's objectively good for people, for the people within their commune, and as well as a private business. In the same way, you could point to, and I know I'm using a socialist/communist argument for this, but the early church as well. The early church in the New Testament.
Right.
But in both cases,
there's some commentary on that, but we will not go into that. But off the air, I'm going to refute you.
I'd love to hear it. Honestly, I'd love to hear it. This just came to mind as we were discussing it. But in both cases, and I would say more than that, you're looking at everyone being involved is on a voluntary basis, and it is in both cases that I've brought up in very small quantities. And I think both things are extremely important to keep in mind when you are looking at keeping everything liberty centered, as I believe Rothbard would want it. As long as everyone, is deciding for themselves what they are involved in and to what level, they're involved in. You're maintain liberty is being maintained. Obviously, I'm hiccuping at this point, so I may be a little bit drunk. But what are y'all?
Well, that
I
is your
appreciate
freedom and
that.
right
What-
to do so, sir.
We're drunk on
I'm
liberty,
so
though.
drunk on liberty.
We're drunk on liberty, though.
What are y'all's thoughts on that?
That it was Rothbard. Rothbard said that kind of all of that is brought together and it's liberty-minded. Is that what
Well, is that what you're
basically,
asking?
like how does that bump up against Rothbard's ideology? Because you're the expert here.
Okay, so basically, it basically bumps up against his ideology because he thought that, you know, giving away, like if you were to enter into a commune or to something like that, you're actually giving away your liberty in a sense, and that people do not have the agency to give up their liberty. That it's anarcho-capitalism in his mind is a very individualist perspective, and that it must remain individualist. And because the thing is, one could extrapolate that out of these communes or whatever, well, then the theory of the iron law of oligarchy is going to come into play, where there's going to be some people who are naturally going to rise to be a king, let's say. Okay, in that society, and everybody in that society is going to consent to it. Now, whether that, like you said, like examples in literature, like that maybe survives one generation and then flips to something else, you know, because people are like, and we can see examples in other literature, like in, for example, religious texts, like in 1 Samuel, where they had a series of judges. And Lou Rockwell has some good commentary on this as well. A series of judges, and they would judge on the law of Israel, and people said, no, we need a king. We absolutely need this guy has good ideas, and he can tell us how to live. And in the story, you know, in the text, you know, Samuel prays to God, and basically he comes to the conclusion that if that happens, then he's going to take away your daughters as his concubines. He's going to send your sons off to war. He's going to take 10% of your crop, you know, all this other kind of stuff. But if you want that, go right ahead. And people still said yes. People still said yes, and Israel still had a king. So you can imagine this happening at a small level, where you're basically going to create a state. And so Rothbard kind of goes into where that is anti-individualist and anti-liberty, is because of the potential of that for happening. Each individual basically needs to be his own state, where he constructs means of production that he controls by himself, and that is what is transferred externally, as in outside of his property and self, to bring him more liberty, more money, more capital, more ways to make his situation better. And that's why anarcho-capitalism is a kind of a monolith, in which it doesn't really correspond with mutualism, or, you know, libertarian socialism, as it's been called. And, yeah, libertarian socialism, as it's been called, which is where we get the term voluntarist, because voluntarism allows the ability to have mutualism, or, you know, something like that. But at the same, you have to understand the implications that Rothbard draws. It has been played out in society. It has happened I mentioned Iceland earlier.
Right.
Iceland is now socialist. The population is very small. They have only a couple 100,000 people, but Iceland is now very socialist. They have nationalized healthcare. They have this and that, you know, socialist precepts. And so anarcho-capitalism, like I said, is a monolith, in which, like, unless people produce in and of themselves, then it kind of reduces the amount of liberty that each one of those people have. And to recognize that you can't sign away your liberty to try to get more is impossible. You can't do that. So that's his philosophy relating to all of this. So, yeah.
Okay. So it sounds like, to explore a little bit more on the example of Iceland, it sounded like initially when you first used it as an example, it was the individuals kind of grouping together and saying, this is what's best for us. But in the modern context, it's more of we're giving the power that we have as individuals up to the government, and the government will decide what is best for us. Is that accurate to say?
Yeah, and a lot of the motivation was to be more of an external society, to try to get more involved in other countries. So, into the UN and the EU and things like that, and be more of kind of a. And a lot of the issue that they had with this that spurred it on was immigration. They just didn't have any. Period. And to name another philosopher, Milton Friedman has some, which he's a Chicago economist, so it's kind of out of the scope of what we're talking about. But he had some good commentary on immigration that you should look into. Anyway, they didn't have a lot of immigration, which was kind of adversely affecting them. So they thought, like, well, maybe if we were more, in and of the world, then we'll be able to kind of quell that. And they haven't at all. And they've had increased taxes. They've had reduced freedoms. They've had, increased bureaucracy and situations that the individual cannot control. They wanted it, and they voted wrong, and they're suffering for it. And there's lands upon lands of just empty. It's empty. And there's nothing wrong with it. You could have farmland. You could have, another town. You could have this and that. But the thing is, the government says, well, there's a species of worm that lives there.
Oh, gosh.
However true or not it is. And the capitalism follows individualism. And right. when you give up a part of your individualism, then when you give up part of the way that you can achieve capital, you also give up your individualism, and you give up your freedom. And so that's kind of Rothbard's idea in relating to that specific example. So, okay. Yeah.
Well, so it sounds like, and I don't want to minimalize it too much, but it sounds like it's Rothbard's ideology is very closely related to that of Thomas Hobbes, where he kind of introduces the idea of the social contract theory, that in the way that power is transferred from the people to the government, and it's a definite transfer of power. There's no sort of half and half, or there's no retraction on the part of the people. Basically, in the way that we have this power as individuals or as society apart from the government. And if we choose to give a fraction or a more substantial amount of our power from ourselves to the government, then that's it. That power has been given to the government, and we're not expecting you to get it back. I don't want to simplify it too much, but it sounds like that's what's going on, at least in the example of Iceland, and probably in the EU as a whole.
Well, Rothbard is very opposed to the idea of social contract theory, and it's where he differs from him on that idea. And basically because of the idea of inalienability of human will and also human rights. Their rights are connected to property, and they are inseparable. And for someone to say that it can be like given up, then you might as well be a slave at that point in time, which you have just completely gone against everything that you would hold morally. You have no moral agency left anymore. You have signed it over, and you have said, you are in control of me. If you say one thing, if you say, like, maybe I should pay, maybe I should do this, it would be okay if, like, one person, if we serve 1 year in the military, they own your life. You're done. Like, so it's just, the whole idea it differs from that. The theory of social contract is the fact that it can be something that is given over when it actually it inherently can't. Like you have your human will and your morality, and for someone else to say that they can violates that. So that's the core of the issue, the crux of the issue. If someone else says that they can take that away, well, that's violating that. That's violating, the NAP, the non-aggression principle. And so you have every right in your being to say no, regardless of what society or everybody else says. You are your own state. You are the individual.
That's no, it
I hope that
absolutely
kind of
does.
answers that.
That's beautiful.
That's awesome.
Oh my gosh, I'm basking in your glory, Chris. That as an individual. Well, hey, you know
Easy
what?
on the
He's
drink
also
there,
a pretty
Will.
good-looking guy.
You know what? Wait.
This is all audio.
Are you looking through my profile pics?
I may not be.
Doing?
That is
Creeper?
up to you to find out in the future. But, but in any event, no. But seriously,
wow.
What you said. Whereas the individual is in a sense their own state as far as the power of the individual and the state and social contract theory. I mean, that summarizes his ideology as a whole just in a perfect little package, man. That's awesome. That there are, it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like Rothbard took the founding fathers' idea of inalienable rights and took it to even further lengths. And he said that, this power transition between the individual and government or society and government, it's more than what Thomas Hobbes said. It's more than what John Locke said. It's more than what the founding fathers said. We're going to take it to even greater lengths and say that, no, I mean, that there are certain issues within individual rights or individual liberties that the individual cannot give away. They don't even have a choice. They cannot give these things away. Is that accurate to say?
That it's more so that it is aggression for someone else to suggest they can.
Beautiful. Well, we're going to wrap it up. We're getting. I'm sorry. Finish your thought, please.
Oh no, go ahead. Sorry, I was clearing my throat.
Oh no, that's right. So we're gonna wrap it up because we're getting to the tail end of our time here. But in 30 seconds, if you could summarize Rothbard's overall ideology, how would you put it?
I would put Rothbard's ideology as being one that favors the will and dominance of the person, of the individual over their own life. That they can decide what product they want to produce, what entertainment they would like to consume, and what friendships they would like to form. And this is the essential part to what makes humans humans. That we can decide for ourselves where we belong, who what societies we fit into, and also how we can better ourselves. And in turn, in bettering ourselves, we also better other people around us through the means of gaining capital and distributing that capital by our own will and by our own voluntary interactions.
So
Hell yeah.
as individuals, as we make up society, in the same way that we as individuals can control society, that's beautiful. I love it. Tom, do you have anything else for Chris?
No, I've just been not quite basking in his glory, but I've been enjoying the time. And
I'm glad there's one
you
person who's honest in this conversation.
I resent that accusation, sir.
No, I think William is quite honest. Yeah, I think you were quite honest. You're basking in his knowledge. But no, thank you for coming on and chatting with us. It's been
Absolutely.
fun.
I'm glad you had me. So, had me on the show.
Well, thank you, Chris.
Yeah, I'm not your father.
Right. Okay,
so.
well, yeah.
That you know of.
Yeah.
So thank you, Chris, for joining us, Rothbard enthusiast and expert. We'd love to have you on again. I know we had a couple of other segments that we were kind of hashing out as far as is it Bastiat or Bastia?
Bastiat. Yeah.
Bastiat.
Bastiat.
You know, maybe. Go ahead, Tom.
I was just going to say, yeah, if people want to hear more from you and get in touch with you on Twitter and whatnot, how do they do that?
You can find me on Twitter at gosh, do I remember even my Twitter handle? So it's think it's think Chris OG is what it is. So it's at think Chris OG. That's where you can find me on Twitter. I regularly tweet at Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. So haven't gotten any responses, but I did get my tweet stolen by Justin Amash one time.
That's actually a pretty big achievement right there. I'm not going to even lie to you.
I have several people who can attest to that. So anyway.
So you can reach Chris on Twitter, and Chris, we would love to have you on again on the show, and we can even further explore the topics that we've discussed tonight. Chris, thank you so much for coming on. We'd love to have you back, and continue to join us to become more liberty-centered.
Absolutely.